It was a warm, humid, sunny morning. Henry had left the back screen door open on their little two-bedroom bungalow, and the baby, who was just old enough to run, had immediately charged out the door, naked and giggling, before tumbling into the grass. Henry was right behind. He was a young man and not in bad shape, but he carried wounds from Korea that slowed him down. Exposure to burning chemicals had seared his lungs, often leaving him short of breath. There was shrapnel embedded in his torso that led to frequent pain and weakness in his arms and back, and he'd been too close to an explosion, resulting in tinnitus. He was reminded of his limitations in moments like these, when he raced after the baby, always imagining the worst, the what-if of arriving too late. But then he saw their baby, naked on the dewy lawn, giggling, happy, and the bad thoughts went away. Henry scooped his son into his arms, laughing himself now, brushing away little bits of lawn clippings from the baby's damp skin. He murmured happily to his child, nuzzling him, and the baby touched his face. Henry was aware, of course, of the black void in the blue morning sky above him. It was a perfect circle, large enough now to take up about a third of the sky. He didn't look at it, and instinctively he tried to conceal it from his baby's view. The baby had seen it before. This wasn't the first time their baby had made a runner for the back door on a pleasant morning, and more than once Henry had found their baby looking up at it, one chubby finger in his tiny mouth. He looked up at Henry then, as if expecting Henry to name the black void, to explain it, give its proper place in their world, as Henry did other things. House, fence, moon, birdies, bugs, tree. The baby pointed at it, trying to call the familiar naming ritual forth. But Henry had simply picked his child up, cradling him, and gone back inside their house, as he did now, taking a towel from the handle of the stove to dry the last of the dew and wipe away the last of the clippings. In the living room, Professor Einstein and Dr. Oppenheimer were on television again, talking about the hole in the sky. They called it the Schwarzschild Singularity, an object predicted by their calculations, but something which they'd believed was just a quirk of mathematics, and not something that could physically exist in reality. Well, wasn't the joke on them? They thought it was a star that had collapsed in on itself, creating a point of infinite gravity, something so dense that even light could not escape it. The why it appeared to be wandering aimlessly through the Earth's neighborhood was a mystery, and whether or not it would pass the Earth by, or collide with it as many feared, was something they simply did not know. Henry turned off the TV. There was no getting away from it any more. It was in the sky 24 hours a day now. He'd had a few dreams in recent months of going outside and the hole being gone, and the relief he felt in those dreams was overwhelming. Dreams where the world was sane again, and they could go back to worrying about the bomb and the Russians and polio, and not some rupture in space that was going to eat the universe. Henry was thinking about this as he put their baby on the couch and got the baby's diaper on. The baby looked up at Henry with those bright eyes and chubby cheeks, a sweetness, a cuteness that Henry could not have imagined until it was made real, until he was able to hold it and kiss it and realize it was his child, his and Margaret's. He loved their baby so much. Their baby deserved a world that could go on, forever and ever, free from impossible nightmares that appeared one day from above. They had it so good. It had all worked out. Henry went through hell in Korea, but they received benefits as a result, with his ability to work being so compromised. He was at home with the baby, while Margaret got to pursue her passion of nursing. A lot of hospitals let nurses go once they got married and had families, but they made an exception for Margaret since her husband couldn't work. It wasn't the normal way, but it was their way, and it worked for them. Henry loved his daily rituals. Now he'd put baby in his high chair for his first meal, and then Henry would have his own breakfast. Later it would be baby's nap, and Henry would have dinner waiting for Margaret when she came home, tired, in her pretty white uniform and cap, her cape too if it was chilly outside. Henry turned on the little radio in their sunshine yellow kitchen. He liked music, but beyond that, the noise really did help with the ringing in his ears. He sang along with Papa Loves Mambo. Look at him sway with it, getting so gay with it, shouting olé with it, wow. He used to enjoy singing when he was younger. Margaret used to beg him to. But it was harder to sing since his injuries. He couldn't get the breath support he once had. He could still carry a tune, but his voice lacked strength now. He and Margaret used to go dancing. They'd gone once since the baby, although Henry had to take a lot of breaks. The movement was murder on his back. But for those minutes when it felt good, well, Papa loves a mambo tonight. It was such a waste. They both knew all the steps. He was only 26, and Margaret just 24. He never expected this life for himself, a body that halfway didn't work, spending his days around the house, taking care of the baby like the good little woman, while his wife did long hours and brought home the paycheck. They relied heavily on his veterans' benefits, too, so at least in that way he was providing something. Margaret never shamed him, but she didn't have to. Any time a salesman came to the door and was confronted with the man of the house, or when he was seen by women and the elderly at the corner store with a baby on his shoulder, or pushing a stroller through the park at noon, he felt their judgments in his bones. Why wasn't he at work? Was he a layabout, a kept man, some sort of Lothario? Sometimes he even had the pleasure of hearing those judgments voiced aloud. Henry enjoyed his life, but he was also proud, and it wasn't his fault he was here. He'd served his country and been wounded badly. They were doing the best they could with the hand they'd been dealt. It was his sacrifice that had paid for their house. His wife was a workhorse and a saint, and in those moments of judgment he wanted to throw his groceries down and grab those judgmental strangers by the lapels and explain all of this to them through a haze of blood-red resentment. But it would do no good, and it would scare the baby. So he didn't. They're having their fling again, younger than spring again, feeling that zing again, wow. Margaret worked so hard. She'd had to beg to not be let go when they got married. Henry had to go down and talk to the hospital directors himself, as if his wife, who managed their bills, couldn't be trusted to explain their marital finances on her own. He told them the same thing Margaret had told them, that without her income and the increases that her advancement promised, they wouldn't make it, because he couldn't work, and his benefits only paid so much. But because he was a man in a suit, with a limp from the war, they finally heard reason. It had made them both so angry, the stupidity of it. But they won in the end, and they were surviving. That was what mattered. Even though Margaret came home exhausted every night, and Henry hated that. So she would at least come home to a hot meal and a happy baby and a house that was as clean as his battered bones would allow, and a husband who would smile through his frustrations and pain and be there for her. Their baby played on the floor, hugging his little stuffed fishy, his chubby legs kicking, as Henry cleaned up from breakfast. Around midday, it was time for the baby's nap, and with him safely sequestered in his crib, Henry could work on the lawn. They just had a basic push mower, but thankfully the front and back were both quite small. Even so, Henry had to take breaks. He was lean, with no belly painfully weighing down his spine, but the war wounds would act up from both the heat and the exertion. He took the lawn in sections, with rests in between. He pushed himself through the front with minimal breaks, feeling humiliated for the neighbors to see a man who looked young and fit, and who was home all day, unable to handle their small front yard in one go. But once he moved on to the back, he listened to his body more and worked slowly. And while in the front yard he had the distractions of the trees, in the back he was fully exposed to the hole in the sky. When Henry was working around the clothesline or the edges of Margaret's vegetable garden, he had to be mindful. But when he was simply pushing the mower across open lawn, his mind would wander, and his eyes would drift up to that looming darkness. He felt like it should make the day cold. He felt like it should emit some kind of sound, like a deep drone or a deafening, high-pitched whine. He thought it should swirl like a whirlpool or a hurricane, but it did nothing. While it was always growing, it grew imperceptibly, day to day. It seemed unchanging and completely inert. Sometimes to Henry it felt like an eye watching, examining the entire world. Sometimes it was more like a mouth, ready to swallow the whole world. The brain very much wanted the darkness to be an orb, a sphere, not a hole. A sphere could be understood as something that had sort of rolled up upon them. A hole in reality could not. How could there be a hole in space? And yet there he was looking at it, and it back at him. It was what it was, just as he was Henry Brown, husband and father, walking wounded, damaged goods. He'd just finished the backyard when he heard the baby crying. He immediately dropped the push mower and ran inside. The baby was fine, just fussing. Henry picked him up and held his baby against his chest. The baby's little fingers worked their way into Henry's shirt, and quickly the little one calmed. But Henry's back was on fire. He'd overdone it today. Ah, damn it all. He limped back out to the living room with the baby and sat on the couch. Oh, this one was bad. His brain couldn't remember being injured, hit by shrapnel, any of that. But his body did. In these moments, Henry knew his body was having flashbacks, reliving the moment of the wounding, because the pain became so intense, so real. He could feel the hot metal, hot and sharp, inside his back. The outer scars really were not that bad, and few would ever see them. But the first time Margaret saw his X-rays, she wept, because he was mangled inside. Just getting up hurt. Getting up without disrupting the baby hurt even worse. But Henry's son looked at peace now, curled up against him, and Henry would not deprive his son any moments of quiet peace. So he took it all upon himself, upon his injured spine, wincing and making a sudden pained sound as he worked his way upright. Then, finally, came the glass of cold water and the pills that would bring him relief, gradually, maddeningly slowly, but better than nothing, much better. Papa does great with it, swings like a gate with it, he loses weight with it now. He stood at the kitchen window as the medicine took hold, rocking his baby in his arms. He remembered when the hole appeared, first as a black star in the daytime, then as a disk surrounded by perpetual twilight. There was always a band of night sky around it, even at noon, in which stars were visible. And this faded into bold sunset colors, which then faded into the daytime blue. The sun, moon, and planets could move in front of the anomaly, though the appearances distorted and stretched when they did so. But the background stars skirted around the edges of the void, forming a twinkling halo, like glowing water drops circling a drain, yet never disappearing down it. The day of cleaning he'd planned was ruined by his back spasm. He managed to tidy up the mower and such that he'd left in the yard, pick up the toys in the living room, and keep their kitchen and dinette clean at least. He made meatloaf, Margaret's recipe, with mashed potatoes, gravy, and mixed vegetables. Henry and the baby were both clean and smiling when Margaret came home. His beautiful wife, she of the fair skin and raven hair in her nurse's whites. She'd taken off the cap, which she dropped casually on their kitchen table, but she was wearing her cape as it had been a damp, cold evening. Henry checked the clock. She was later than usual. He looked at her, and before he could say anything, Margaret said, in her quiet, patient, exhausted voice, "We had another suicide. Too many of them, Henry. Too many." He crossed to her immediately and wrapped his arms around her. She was stiff for a moment, then relaxed against him. There was a story on the evening news, he said. Some whole tribe or village somewhere in western China. They... "Please don't," she said, and so he immediately stopped. When she looked up at him, there were no tears in her eyes, no obvious signs of strain that a stranger might notice. But Henry knew his wife well. She left work half an hour ago, and still had her hospital face on. That rarely happened in the old days. By the time she walked in that door, she was Margaret again, his Margaret. But here she was, still Nurse Brown, a person he didn't entirely know, and who, it seemed, did not quite know how to relax in front of Margaret Brown's husband. Baby sat in his high chair next to the dinette table, his arms outstretched, chubby fingers drawing in and then extending out in the universal baby language for, "Please come here, Mommy." She went to him, a smile that was something more like Margaret finally spreading over her face. She picked their son up and kissed him, bouncing him. "What's for dinner?" she asked. "It smells terrific." The president spoke on television after dinner. It was something he'd taken to doing a few times a month. He would provide assurances that the geniuses at Los Alamos were studying the Schwarzschild Singularity, learning how it worked, how it was moving, how we might perhaps move it away from us, using the world's arsenal of atom bombs, that sort of thing. Henry didn't know if he believed any of it, but it felt good to hear something from the president. This clear but implacable threat to the world had, in a way, brought about peace, though the old tensions were always simmering. He had no doubt that if the hole in the sky disappeared tomorrow, the Cold War would be back on the very next day. There was a feeling, though, that all the world was in this together. But in a world where the Russians and the Chinese were less cooperative, it might have been easier to believe that maybe they had some secret plan that might save the world yet. "Turn that off, please," Margaret said quietly. Henry was standing in front of the TV now, while she was still sat at their dinette, picking at the last of her dinner. "What?" he asked, and this time, when she repeated, "I said turn it off," there was an unmistakable edge in her voice, and he did not fail to understand her a second time. Henry reached down immediately, switching the set off. He didn't really want to. He appreciated the news. He wanted to hear those comforting words, that the world's best worked tirelessly on the question of the hole in the sky. But he could hear Margaret's fork stabbing at her plate now in a way it didn't normally do, and when he went into the dining room and touched her shoulder, she shrugged him away. Then she stood, not looking at him, and began to wash her dishes in the sink. "Margaret," he said. He allowed a few feet between them. His back was killing him. He leaned against the kitchen counter on one arm. She didn't face him, but she acknowledged him by shaking her head. Henry sighed. He wasn't angry or disappointed. If anything, he blamed himself. His wife worked hard. Then she came home to a half-clean house and a mediocre meal. If she wanted peace and quiet tonight, then she'd get it. He should have known, really, that that was what she'd want. "I just need a minute, Henry," she said, her voice low and still as ice. The house was uncomfortable now, with the television off and Margaret silent, and Henry afraid to say anything that might further upset her. Even their baby was quiet now, looking at Henry with those precious eyes, so full of questions, so hungry for understanding and love. Henry took the baby out of the high chair and carried him over to the couch, talking quietly to him, cooing at him, trying to entertain him so that Margaret would not be bothered. Once she'd cleaned her dishes, she picked up her nurse's cap and cape and went to their bedroom. It was part of the ritual. Now she would change, and her transformation from Nurse Brown to Margaret would be complete. Yet several minutes went by, and she did not emerge, and this was unusual. Henry waited a bit longer, in case she was just taking her time or wanted a moment to herself. But finally the silence stretched on too long. He put their baby back in his chair and then went to the bedroom after his wife. He found her in their tiny ensuite bathroom, still in her uniform, weeping into her hands. "Margaret," he said, dropping to his knees beside her. She didn't look at him, but said, "The suicide this afternoon. A mother of 3, Henry, and she took her babies with her. Dressed them in their Sunday best. Little ones, the eldest was 6. What did she tell them? That they were going somewhere fun? They never left the garage." She looked up at him now, and her pretty face was streaked with tears. "There are more of them all the time," she said. And as that thing gets bigger, it's going to get worse. And Henry, I'm afraid that one day it's going to be me, that I'll be so convinced. And Henry was kneeling beside the commode with his arms wrapped around his wife. His back and hips were on fire, and one shoulder was screaming. Of course he noticed he was in terrible pain, but that would wait. Now his Margaret needed him, and that was all that mattered. He understood what she said. It wasn't the first time they'd ever had a conversation like this. This was simply the most direct conversation. While Henry was at home, he could choose to listen to the scientists and the president or not. But his wife had no such luxury of choice. She was on the front line every day of what this strange turn of events was really doing to people. "That will never be you, dear," he said, "because we've made vows to each other, through better or worse. Even if that means the end of the world, you and our baby and me." And he kissed her damp cheek. "But, Henry," she started to say. He interrupted her. "And if it ever came to that," he said quietly, gripping her hand, "that we had to make a choice like that, to spare ourselves or to spare our child, then you wouldn't be alone, making that choice alone. Do you hear me?" Margaret's face crumpled, the last of her reserves spent. She collapsed against her husband, her arms thrown around his neck, pulling him close. In a moment she'd realized the pain he must be in, and she'd release him and help him stand. But in this brief moment she clutched him tightly against her. He was perfect, the most wonderful man, the most ideal husband. She couldn't imagine having any greater fortune than this. "Make love to me tonight," she said, "once he's asleep." "Gladly," Henry replied. They held each other in the quiet darkness of their bedroom for a few minutes, standing now, pressed together as they were back when they would go dancing. They didn't need music now, and they might have stayed that way except that, finally, they heard their child's clumsy but cheerful cry from the dinette. "Ma, ma, ma." "He wants me," Margaret said. "Yes," Henry said, grinning. "He must get sick of me after whole days together. Babies always want their mammas." Margaret shook her head as she pulled herself reluctantly from her husband. "No," she said, "he isn't missing a thing. You're a wonderful daddy." They went back out, and Margaret now really was herself. She scooped their tiny son into her arms, and his giggles became her giggles. She kissed his chubby cheeks and his soft baby curls. She pressed his little body against her own, smelling and kissing the top of his head. As Henry watched this, the love in his own heart felt like it might explode. He understood entirely how his wife felt. He watched the news, and he heard about tragedies in other lands. She saw those tragedies unfold before her eyes. She saw families like theirs, where a parent finally cracked under the oppressive force of that giant black weight in their sky. After all, even a baby knows that a weight suspended in the air is bound to fall before long, and that the ending will not be a happy one if getting out of the way is impossible. Of course Henry had considered the worst. People reacted in countless ways, but it was hard for him to imagine that many adults hadn't considered what they might do if the unthinkable became the inevitable. Henry would not let his family meet their end in fear or in pain. torn apart by irregular physics beyond their understanding, or cowering in the dark, counting down the minutes until some unspeakable thing finally struck. That was no way to live. He'd learned that in Korea. He'd learned much about how not to live and how not to die over there in the war. Much of it he'd told to Margaret. Some of it he still hadn't, and maybe never would. Buddies who died in his arms. Buddies who begged for it to be over. But their current situation hadn't demanded that kind of thinking. Not yet, anyway. And maybe it never would. He prayed it wouldn't. The evening news was over, and it had given way to lighter fare. They had settled finally into their proper evening routine. It was almost time for baby's bedtime. He was lying in front of the television, enjoying his warm bottle of chocolate milk. Perry Como and his background singers were on TV, and Henry was doing his best to hum along the way he used to do when breathing came easier. Margaret had finally changed and let her hair down, which always made her look about 19 again. And, smiling, she took her husband's hands and began to lead him gently into a swaying sort of dance. It was nothing wild, but it would do. Baby looked up at them, laughing, kicking his little feet. All around the world, people were looking up and worrying about the hole in the sky. But that night, at the home of the Brown family, they were at peace. Henry, with the support of his wife, managed to find his breath and sang along. Don't let her rumba, don't let her samba, 'cause Papa loves to mambo tonight.